Story 1. When I was a kid, maybe around 12 or 13, my friends and I used to go bowling a lot. There was this old bowling alley just down the block from where we lived, and it became our regular hangout spot on weekends. Back then, the place was cheap, which was perfect for a group of broke teenagers like us. That bowling alley has been closed for years now, but I can still remember those nights like they were yesterday. One Saturday night, I went there with my usual group, Ethan, Ryan, and Chris. It must have been around 8 o'clock in the evening. The place was always packed on the weekends, and we would sometimes spot people we recognized. There was this one older guy who stood out to us. He was usually by himself, playing on the side of the alley where they served alcohol. We, of course, stuck to the non-alcoholic side. What made him memorable was how he acted. He would wander up and down the entire bowling alley, casually watching people bowl. Then, he would just head back to his lane like nothing happened. We started calling him Creepy Carl, because he gave off such an unsettling vibe. After seeing him a few times, we all agreed there was something off about him. That night, a lane opened up right next to ours. And guess who showed up? Yep, Carl. He set up his game by himself, and before long, he started talking to us. At first, it was just small comments about our bowling form, but then he kept interrupting us with weird tidbits about how often he came to the alley. Eventually, he dropped this bizarre comment about how he had been watching us bowl from across the alley for weeks and decided to come over to introduce himself. He tried to play it off like he was some kind of bowling coach, offering us tips and advice. But honestly, it was just creepy and uncomfortable. Things got even worse when I was up to bowl, and he came into our lane, grabbed my wrist, and started trying to position me like I needed his help. I never asked for his advice, and I definitely did not want him touching me. We were only kids, so none of us really had the guts to tell him to get lost. But the tension among us was obvious. After that, we decided to cut the night short. Instead of spending the rest of our money on more games, we headed to a pizza place further down the block. It was a relief to get away from Carl. Once we finished eating, Ethan and Chris headed home since they lived in a different direction, and Ryan and I walked back toward our houses together. As we were walking, we heard a car engine start behind us. We turned around and saw this beat-up old SUV, something like a Ford Explorer, making a sharp three-point turn. Right away, we both thought the same thing. Could it be Carl? Sure enough, the SUV started creeping along behind us. We picked up the pace, but the car pulled up next to us, and the window rolled down. It was him. Carl leaned out and offered us a ride home. We immediately said no, but he kept insisting, saying it was not safe for a couple of kids to be out late. That just made it worse. We were not little kids, and the fact that he thought he could trick us into getting in his car was terrifying. When we refused again, he parked his SUV on the side of the road. That was enough for us. We took off jogging. At the next intersection, Ryan and I split up. I said goodbye and jogged the rest of the way home. By the time I got back, I was completely out of breath. Running after eating pizza? Bad idea. My dad was already asleep since he worked weekends, and my mom and sister were probably out. My dad had strict rules about not ringing the doorbell late at night, so I went around to the backyard to grab the spare key from the shed. As I stepped out of the shed with the key, I thought I heard something behind me. I should have trusted my instincts, but I brushed it off. I unlocked the back door, and just as I started to open it, I heard the sound of footsteps running up behind me. Before I could fully turn around, someone grabbed me from behind, shoving me into the house. Their hand clamped over my mouth, and their other arm wrapped tightly around my neck. I could not see who it was since they held my head in place. My heart raced as I clawed and scratched at the person's hand, desperate to get free. I managed to shift my mouth just enough out of their grip to let out a muffled scream. Dad! Even though I was just 13, I fought back as hard as I could, thrashing and wriggling in their grasp. My struggling must have caught them off guard because I felt their grip loosen a couple of times. Each time I screamed, it seemed to shake them more. Finally, they let go completely and bolted out the back door. I did not stop to look back. Instead, I sprinted up the short flight of stairs to the main floor, shouting for my dad at the top of my lungs. My dad came charging out of his bedroom, his face a mix of confusion and concern. I quickly explained what had just happened. how someone had pushed me inside, held me down, and then ran off. He immediately grabbed a flashlight and checked the backyard and the surrounding area, but whoever it was had already vanished into the night. Once we were back inside, I told my dad everything. About the man from the bowling alley, the one my friends and I had nicknamed Creepy Carl, and how he had followed my friend Ryan and me in his SUV earlier that night. I also mentioned how he had admitted to watching us at the bowling alley over several weekends. Hearing all this made my dad's face darken with anger. The next day, my dad went straight to the police to file a report. He also contacted the bowling alley, asking them to hand over the surveillance footage from that night. Unfortunately, they refused, claiming it was against their policy. After this, my mom found out about everything, and that was the end of my late-night bowling trips. Not that I would have wanted to go back anyway. The wild thing is, I cannot say with 100% certainty that the person who attacked me that night was Carl. But really, what are the odds it was not him? The pieces all fit. His behavior at the bowling alley, following us in his car, and then showing up at my house. It seems too coincidental to have been anyone else. When I think back on my teenage years, my group of friends and I were definitely not the best-behaved kids. I guess you could say we were a little reckless, always getting into things we had no business doing. Growing up in a suburban town in northern New Jersey, we were just a bunch of bored kids looking for excitement. We caused trouble, broke rules, and explored places we should not have been in. One of our favorite pastimes was sneaking out late at night to explore abandoned buildings. That is not all we did, though. One time, we even got banned from our middle school after climbing through an open window. But that is a story for another day. Looking back now, it all seems a bit silly, but at the time, it felt like we were living life on the edge. Story 2. That particular night, we had something riskier planned. There were 5 of us, me, Charlie, Jake, Ryan, and Andy. Now, Ryan was the kind of guy who could never hold down a job for too long. It became a bit of a running joke in our group. He would quit as fast as he got hired, usually for reasons that made no sense. His latest gig was as a night attendant at a bowling alley a few towns over. You can probably guess where this is going. Ryan had been trusted with the key to lock up the place one night, and Andy, being the smooth talker he was, convinced Ryan to let us check out the bowling alley at around 3 in the morning. Honestly, Andy could talk a person out of their life savings if he wanted to. I have not heard from him in a while, but the last I heard, he might be sitting in jail right now. We all agreed to have a few drinks before heading out. Everyone had more than a fair share except for Jake. He was adamant about staying sober if he was driving. His dad owned a really nice BMW, and Jake loved being in control of when the night ended. After we got sufficiently buzzed, Jake drove all 5 of us to the bowling alley. Now, I was the heaviest drinker in the group. Looking back, it was not something I was proud of, but it was just how I was back then. Because of that, I had a habit of treating risky situations like they were no big deal. Ryan unlocked the door, and we slipped inside. Charlie, who was always the cautious one, kept reminding us to be careful in his squeaky, nervous voice. We laughed it off. Ryan quickly shut us down when we asked if we could actually bowl. He said it was out of the question, which bummed us out a bit. That is when I had a brilliant idea. We could slide on the lanes like they were makeshift slip and slides. Being tipsy, this felt like the best idea ever. We had a blast sliding around until we eventually tired ourselves out. Then someone, probably Andy, suggested we explore the back rooms. Ryan reluctantly admitted there were some employee-only areas, so he led us to a storage room. We were acting like idiots, rummaging through boxes and flipping random stuff over. Honestly, we did not care much about keeping things tidy since we figured Ryan was going to lose his job anyway. As we were starting to lose interest, a loud thud came from somewhere below us. The noise was so sudden and so loud that we all froze. Jake, the only sober one, asked Ryan if the place had a basement. Ryan looked as clueless as the rest of us and said he had no idea. Andy's face lit up with curiosity, but Charlie was visibly nervous, muttering something about how we were probably going to get Ryan fired. We started whispering, debating whether we should try to find this supposed basement. That was when Jake noticed a rug in the corner. He lifted it, revealing a hidden hatch. We all stared at it in disbelief. The atmosphere shifted immediately. The playful vibe was gone, replaced by a tense seriousness. Even though we had found the way down, none of us could explain that noise. Jake was the first to make a move, of course. Without hesitation, he yanked the latch open. Beneath it was a rusty old ladder leading into complete darkness. "Nope, I'm out," Charlie said, backing away. Jake ignored him and climbed down, using the flashlight on his phone to guide the way. Ryan, Andy, and I exchanged nervous glances. I was still riding my buzz and felt braver than I should have, so I followed Jake. Andy came after me and Ryan brought up the rear. Charlie refused to join us and stayed upstairs. The four of us moved cautiously through the basement, lighting up the shadows with our phone flashlights. The place was packed with dust and towering stacks of cardboard boxes. At first, it seemed like there was nothing special down there, until Andy noticed a door tucked away in the corner. We crept over to it. Jake reached out and placed his hand on the handle, but just as he started to turn it, just as Jake was about to open the door, we heard another thud, identical to the one we had heard earlier, came from the other side. The sound was sharp and deliberate, and we all froze, exchanging horrified glances. My first thought was that it might be an animal, but that idea quickly evaporated. The noise was far too loud. I was about ready to call it quits. Fear had sobered me up enough to realize how bad this idea was. But Jake, being Jake, cracked the door open anyway. Behind it was another storage room, but that was not all. In the corner, sitting cross-legged on the ground with their back to us, was a human figure. We stood there, completely paralyzed by fear. For what felt like an eternity, nobody moved a muscle. Then, the figure slammed their head against the wall with a sickening thud. The sound explained the noises we had been hearing, and it sent chills down my spine. I decided right then that I was done. Slowly, I began tiptoeing back to the ladder, trying my best not to make a sound. My friends, equally terrified, followed my lead. But as we were inching away, Ryan tripped over some junk on the floor and let out a loud curse. The figure in the corner let out a guttural yell that made my blood run cold. That was all it took for us to bolt. Jake and I scrambled up the ladder in record time, with Andy right on our heels. As I reached the top, I saw Charlie leaning over the hatch, his face pale with worry. Andy made it up, and the three of us ran out of the room, but then we heard Ryan scream, "Get off me!" Jake and Andy were too panicked to stop, but I could not leave him behind. I spun around and saw Charlie hurling a metal pipe down the hatch. The sound of the pipe hitting something was immediately followed by an unearthly scream. Ryan clawed his way up the ladder, and Charlie grabbed his wrist, yanking him to safety. As soon as Ryan was up, Charlie slammed the hatch shut. Without wasting another second, we all ran for the exit. Ryan's hands were shaking as he fumbled with the key to lock the door behind us. Jake drove us home in total silence, his face blank and his knuckles white on the steering wheel. After a few minutes, Ryan finally spoke up. He described what had happened in the basement after we had left him behind. Apparently, the figure had jumped on his back, clawing and growling like a wild animal. That was when Charlie saved him, bashing the attacker with the pipe and causing them to fall backward. Ryan said he only saw the person's face for a split second, but that was enough. They looked like a filthy, deranged old man with wild, tangled hair that resembled a bird's nest. The next day, Ryan quit his job without so much as a word to his boss. We all agreed never to talk about what had happened, mostly because what we did was illegal, but also because none of us wanted to think about it anymore. To this day, we have no clue how that man ended up in the basement. Maybe there was another entrance we had missed, or maybe Ryan's boss knew more than he let on. Whatever the case, the whole experience left a mark on me. I have not stepped foot in a bowling alley since that night. Story 3. One evening, my girlfriend, Emma, and I thought it would be fun to go bowling. We hopped in the car and drove to the nearest bowling alley. Once there, we went through the usual process: renting shoes, finding the right bowling balls, and getting set up with a lane. Neither of us had bowled in years, and honestly, we were both pretty bad at it. We paid for an hour, but Emma was not having the best time. She kept throwing gutter balls, and while I was doing slightly better than her, I was far from good enough to give her any tips. The whole thing was starting to feel like a dud. Then, things got even worse. Out of nowhere, Emma's ex-boyfriend strolled in with a group of his friends and started bowling a few lanes away from us. Emma froze. She refused to look in their direction and leaned over to whisper that we had to leave. Immediately, I did not argue. We packed everything up and left early. She headed straight to the car while I stayed behind to return the shoes. As I handed them back at the counter, I thought her ex might have spotted me, but I quickly looked away. I decided not to mention it to Emma. When we got home, we agreed to play Wii bowling instead and drink some wine. That sounded like a much better plan. I turned on the Wii and opened a bottle of wine. What started as a disappointing night at the bowling alley turned into something much more fun. We spent the next half hour laughing, playing Wii bowling, and listening to music in the background. But then, as one song ended, we both heard something during the brief moment of silence. A heavy thud coming from upstairs. Emma and I immediately locked eyes, realizing we both heard it. I turned the music off completely, and the room was filled with silence. The sound we had heard was unmistakable, like something heavy had dropped onto the floor. I decided to check it out. Grabbing a flashlight, I walked upstairs to investigate. I turned on the lights in every room and checked under every bed. There was nothing, no signs of anyone or anything. It was a relief, but at the same time, I was left wondering what could have caused that noise. After another half hour of Wii bowling and wine, we decided to take our little party upstairs to the bedroom. Emma is a lightweight when it comes to drinking, so she fell asleep pretty quickly. I stayed up a little longer, but eventually I dozed off too. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to another loud thud. This time it felt even closer. It took me a second to realize the sound had come from above us. But we were already upstairs. So what could be above us? Then it hit me, the attic. The attic door was right outside our bedroom. It was one of those pull-down doors with the string and a metal ladder. I got out of bed as quietly as I could, not wanting to wake Emma. Standing under the attic door, I strained to listen. Every few seconds, I heard a faint creaking noise, like something shifting its weight. I did not want to alarm Emma, but I had heard of animals getting into people's attics before. Grabbing a broom from the closet as a precaution, I pulled down the attic door and climbed up the ladder, my phone in hand to use as a flashlight. When I reached the top, I froze. In the dim light of my phone, I saw the wooden rocking chair we had stored up there moving. Someone was sitting in it, rocking slowly back and forth. My heart nearly stopped. Every instinct in me screamed to run back down the ladder, but I forced myself to stay. I managed to yell out, "Who are you?" The rocking stopped. The person turned to face me, and I will never forget the guttural, animalistic sound they made. A sort of growling mixed with gurgling. Then they stood up, and that was it. I scrambled down the ladder as fast as I could, slamming the attic door shut behind me. "Emma, call the cops," I shouted, my voice shaking. She woke up in a panic, and I heard her grab her phone. Meanwhile, I pressed my weight against the attic door, holding it shut as the person above started kicking it, trying to force it open. After a few moments, the kicking stopped, but then I heard something even more chilling. Laughter. It was unhinged, deranged, and sent shivers down my spine. Then, the person started speaking, but it was in a language I could not understand. The strange, guttural words coming from the attic sounded like they were in Russian. My arms were trembling from holding the attic door shut, and I felt like they might give out at any second. I kept pressing my weight against the door, desperate for the sound of sirens. Finally, the police arrived. Emma hurried downstairs to let them in while I stayed in place, refusing to let go of the attic door until they were ready to take over. 2 officers climbed up into the attic while the others stayed with us. Emma and I sat together on the couch, her hands gripping mine tightly. Neither of us said a word as we listened to the officers move around upstairs. A few tense moments later, they brought the man down. He was in handcuffs, and as they led him through the living room, his eyes locked onto mine. That look, I will never forget it. His face was twisted with a mix of hatred, madness, and something else I could not place, almost like he was confused or disoriented. His lips curled in this strange, unnatural way, like someone who was drunk or completely out of their mind. The officers got him outside, and that was the last we saw of him. We did not press any civil charges, but I am sure he was charged criminally unless they decided he was mentally unfit to stand trial. After the police left, Emma and I sat in silence, trying to make sense of what had happened. It was summertime, and we usually kept the windows open to let in the fresh air. The officers thought it was likely the man had climbed in through one of the open windows in the backyard. Why he chose our house, I have no idea. Maybe it was just bad luck. Ours happened to be the one he stumbled across that night.